Well, this is the Introduction to Psychology, History, and Approaches, Section A lecture. Our prioritized standards are 1A and also 1E, and our objective is to differentiate between psychology and other similar disciplines. Now, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, although the term psychology by itself translates simply to the study of the mind. And psychology, this examines both directly observable behaviors, so that would be things like talking, smiling, crying, things you can physically see, and also internal mental processes that can be indirectly observed, so things that you can't really see, like thinking, feeling, or desiring. The findings of psychology are based on objective and verifiable evidence obtained through scientific methods. Now, psychology is beyond speculation about human nature or folk wisdom commonly accepted as true, rather embracing psychological findings that employ what are called the empirical approach. Now, the empirical approach, this means a study conducted through careful observation and scientifically based research, which would use things like observation, induction, deduction, testing, and then evaluation, which would continue on. Now, there are three branches of psychology that describe the work of psychologists. For instance, while all therapists are going to be types of psychologists, not all psychologists are going to be therapists. So, one type would be experimental psychology. Now, with this type, these are psychologists that do research on basic psychological processes. Sometimes they're referred to as research psychologists. This is often done through colleges or universities. Another type is applied psychology. With this type, these would be rather psychologists who use the knowledge developed by the experimental psychologists to solve human problems. So this would mean things like training, equipment design, psychological treatment. While clinical psychologists or therapists do have training in diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders and are types of applied psychologists, most applied psychologists don't have this type of training. So if you're thinking therapist, they are a type of applied psychologist, but not all applied psychologists are therapists. And finally, we have teachers of psychology. So this would mean these are psychologists whose primary job is teaching, typically in a secondary, which would be high school, or higher education, which would be college setting. Now, a lot of times these teachers of psychology at the college level, they are also the ones who do a lot of the experimental psychology also. Now, some things are commonly mistaken for psychology, yet only have some similarities or may not meet the high standards of psychology. Now, there is frequently confusion about the difference between psychology and psychiatry. Now, psychiatry is a medical specialty focusing on the treatment of mental and behavioral issues. Becoming a psychiatrist requires a medical degree, which gives psychiatrists the ability to prescribe medications and perform medical procedures. Now, psychology is going to be a much broader field than psychiatry, and those with doctoral degrees in psychology tend to focus more of their studies on training and different types of research methods. Also, if you take a look at this Venn diagram, it kind of shows you where there are some similarities and some differences. Now, psychology should not be confused with pseudo-psychology, which does not meet the scientific standards of true psychology. Now, pseudo-psychology, they generally make erroneous assertions or practices under the guise of legitimate psychology. Chances are you've probably heard of more than a few different types of pseudo-psychology that masquerades as actual psychology. So, for instance, pseudopsychology includes practices like astrology. So, if you've ever heard, hey, this is what's happening to you because the stars you were born under, this is a type of pseudopsychology. Also, graphology, sometimes called handwriting analysis, that kind of suggests that you can learn something about a person by how they write. Not true. Also, fortune telling. So you can go to a psychic and they'll tell you everything. Yeah, also not really psychology. Also, assertions of the power of subliminal messages in movies, television, and music, and other similar types of practices. It's like fun, sure, but not actually based in truth. Now, many blindly accept pseudopsychology because it feeds into a confirmation bias, where people accept evidence that supports their beliefs or expectations while ignoring evidence that opposes their beliefs. Acceptance of such things waste things like time, your money, also talents of people, and can also nurture fraudulent types of practices. So you should avoid pseudopsychology as much as humanly possible. Now, there are primarily four goals of psychology as a social science. That would include describing behavior, explaining behavior, predicting behavior, and also changing or controlling behavior. In order to describe behavior, psychologists must first observe human behavior through psychological research. Now, this can take the form of case studies, surveys, self tests, or other types of natural observations. After observing behavior, psychologists will describe the behavior, which helps people gain a more accurate understanding and perspective on such human behaviors, actions, and thoughts. Also, describing behavior helps psychologists distinguish between what would be normal or abnormal behavior. Now, when psychologists explain behavior, they attempt to describe why people might behave in the manner that was observed. Now, explaining behavior leads psychologists to develop theories that help explain various aspects of human behavior. So, possibly you might have heard of Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning or Bowlby's attachment theory. Now, when we talk about explaining behavior, they can also develop either mini theories explaining a specific behavior, or possibly grand theories, which are comprehensively explaining all human behaviors to explain aspects of human behavior and therefore psychology. When psychologists predict behavior, they use previously observed behavior to make predictions about how people will think and behave in the future. Now, successfully predicting behavior determines if psychologists truly understand the underlying causes of human behaviors. Now, if a prediction is not confirmed through similar experiments, then the explanation it is based on might need to be revised. After successfully describing behavior and predicting behavior, the final goal of psychology is to change or control behavior. Now, psychology strives to change, influence, or possibly control behavior to make positive, constructive, meaningful, and also lasting changes in people's lives and to influence behavior for the better. When psychology is capable of changing or controlling behavior, society benefits by being able to refrain from repeating destructive behaviors. This goal is often considered the most important goal of psychology. All right, that concludes Introduction to Psychology, History and Approaches, Section A lecture. Again, our prioritized standards were 1A and 1E, and objectively now you can differentiate between psychology and other similar disciplines.